This is Lecture 18 of History of Christian Worship Practices. This is John Chilcote, Worship Professor at Nebraska Christian College. Today we will be looking at the seeker movement of the 1980s and 1990s. This movement was an attractional model, and it was very successful in what it wanted to do in bringing people into the church. It wanted to attract people to come and see what was going on in the church. This was developed primarily with a few churches, but then it was adopted by almost all evangelical churches in some form or fashion across America. It was performance presentation and observation based over participation, meaning they were okay with people coming to church and just watching what is going on, as opposed to entering in and singing and being full in 100% with the activities of the service. And this is different than the charismatic movement. This is different than the people that were moved by the Spirit to express and to be fully engaged in the service. This service, the performance aspect of it, was elevated to have a level of excellence so that they could invite people and somewhat entertain them and offer them scripture and gospel messages and the message of Christ at in a fun, sort of lighthearted way, or a way that wasn't too academic or too theological. It was sort of a bottom shelf experience for people, and then they could observe and make their own decisions without feeling like they had to interact into the church. One of the phrases was, "This is for a church. This is a church for people who don't like church." In the 80s and 90s, there was a big transition with the culture, people pushing against the 40s and 50s cultures of their parents, and this 80s and 90s culture wanted to consume. They wanted to consume more than like before. This was the era where microwaves first started. This is where you started to have the drive-through, which you feel like, why is that not always a thing? But it wasn't always a thing. So this whole consumer mentality, this is where the birth of the internet happened, right? So this performance, presentation, observation model worked because you could invite people, and it was low risk. It was easy to invite people into their services. The movement was categorized by the change in methodology then, and not theology. They never said that the theology of who they would be as a church, or what the church was for Christ, or the theology of the Trinity, theology of communion, of baptism, none of that mattered with the seeker movement. It was all about a methodology of how you would engage the culture. So for the unchurched seeker to be reached, the worship needed to be more attractive and more like the modern culture. So this is when worship bands came up. This is when you would have dramas on stage. You would have lighthearted messages that weren't just preaching from the Bible, but they were talks, not even called sermons anymore, right? So a very big change in culture from the way the churches looked, either the highly liturgical churches or the charismatic movement churches. Rock bands singing secular music or musical styles similar to popular music, quite often they would hardly have any actual worship songs. They would have songs that people would recognize, or maybe they would change the words, or they would write their own songs, but they wouldn't be vertical worship songs or songs that proclaimed the truth of God in any deep theological way. Again, drama sketches or other non-conventional elements were added. Lots of scenes and sets on stages were added. You'd have items that would represent sermon series themes and all these types of things for the first time. Again, and sermons were often named messages or talks, and they were directed to non-believers. So the believers that were part of the church would invite their non-believer friends, their seekers, to be a part of the church. And then many of these seeker movement churches actually had believer services in the middle of the week. And they thought that if they had an opportunity, it was still a culture where people would go to church on Sunday. So let's bring the non-churched people to church on Sunday and teach them, and then we would teach the believers, those that had a stronger faith, in the middle of the week. And again, most churches adopted this, while many denominations continued in their traditional liturgies. The structure, they adopted the seeker movement. And there were a few modern voices pushing against this movement. One of them was Sally Morgenthaler, and she wrote this book, Worship Evangelism. You see on the right the original first edition cover from the 80s, and then you see it repackaged in a second edition. But she pushed extremely against this whole seeker movement, saying that if you bring people in and they actually see Christians doing what they're supposed to do at church, which is worship God, that is going to draw them to God more than putting on a show and just convincing them in a lighthearted way that Jesus loves them and that God cares for them and that God created them for a purpose. If we don't show them how to worship and how to be the church, she argued, then they would never actually become part of it, but they would just be a consumer of what the church had to offer. Let's look now at a few major movements, major churches in this seeker movement. First, Robert Schuller. In 1955, Dr. Schuller was called by the Reformed Church in America to begin a new church in Garden Grove, California. With his wife, Arvella, as organist, and $500 in assets, he rented the Orange Drive-In Theater, which I'll show you a picture of that here in a second. But he started in Chicago area, Ivanhoe Reformed Church. A complete side note, my grandfather was also a pastor in the 1950 to 1953 in Ivanhoe at the Methodist Church, so he actually knew Pastor Schuller. And we'll talk about the rest of these here in a minute. So under with his $500, he rented out this drive-in theater, and he conducted Sunday services from the tar-papered roof of its snack bar. 100 people attended that first Sunday service, all in their cars. Dr. Schuller, who believed that this outdoor ministry experience helped him to later build the all-glass Crystal Cathedral. He said he fell in love with the sky, but this is a completely unorthodox way to have church, where people could just drive up and they could hear the message and they could hear songs played over the speaker in their radio. And they never even had to leave their church or leave their cars to go to church. So under Dr. Schuller's leadership, the first walk-in drive-in church building was designed by Richard Neutra in 1961. And then in 1970, with the encouragement of Dr. Billy Graham, Dr. Schuller began to broadcast services from the Neutra Sanctuary on the Hour of Power television show. By 1975, the Hour of Power was airing in all 50 states. And the unprecedented growth of the local congregation dictated the decision to build the internationally acclaimed Crystal Cathedral. Designed by award-winning architect Philip Johnson, the first ever all-glass church was dedicated on September 14th, 1980. And here are a few pictures. So Robert Schuller was one of the first televangelists. And again, he was in all 50 states. I remember growing up as a child of the 80s, there was an aerial view, seeing the Hour of Power on TV. And it was a very liturgical service. They had a choir, they had an organ, everyone wore robes. But what he preached, and part of his maybe downfall, was that he preached such a surfacey, not necessarily prosperity gospel, but it was an easy gospel. It was a Jesus loves you and there's nothing else you need to do. Sort of Joel Osteen-esque, but different back in the day. And then it is important to note that now that the Crystal Cathedral actually went bankrupt and they had to sell the entire building. So now this is a Catholic church called Christ Cathedral, and it's part of the Diocese of Orange County. Interesting. The next person we're going to talk about. Next, we will talk about Willow Creek Community Church and Bill Hybels. And if you notice with these churches, they are very much driven by their leader and not necessarily by a theology or a denomination. Bill Hybels is from the Christian Reformed background, similar to Robert Schuller, also in Chicago. He was a youth pastor at South Park Church in Park Ridge, Illinois, and he started this youth group called Sun City. And out of this youth group, he eventually planted Willow Creek Community Church. He founded it on October 12th, 1975 at the Willow Creek Theater in Palatine, Illinois. And so it's called Willow Creek Community Church because that was the name of the theater at the time that they met. Today there's over 20,000 people and attending 8 campuses in the metro area. So growing from a youth group to this large crowd. The key themes are taken straight from Acts 2 that have they've transcended individual leaders, ministries, and eras. The themes are part of Willow's DNA as a church to go and make disciples, right? At the church's mission is to turn irreligious people into fully followers of Christ. That remains the church's singular passion. Here's an aerial view. If you look right up on the top right corner, you'll see that little hexagon, octagon type building. That was the original building by the small little lake. And then they kept building on to the offices. And then this huge part that says Willow Creek, that's the large auditorium that they built now. And they have the name over the church because when you fly into O'Hare in Chicago, you can see it on the flight path. So you can recognize that that's Willow Creek Church. So the South Barrington campus that we just saw seats 7,000. And at one time they were having 3 services there with over 7,000, over 20,000 going, because in the main auditorium has 7, but then they would have overflow rooms and some commons areas where people could watch and be a part of the services on the screens, and also all of the people in the kids ministry and all the other parts of the building going on through the morning. There are 8 campuses in Chicagoland Metro. And in 2018, there were 28,000 plus attendees. They started a Willow Creek Association early on with all of their strategies and all of their resources that they were developing for the seeker movement and their small groups movement and their children's ministry movement and also their creative arts movement, which they did a whole lot because they were so forward thinking in the seeker movement. Their creative arts and music movement was replicated over and over again. So they started this Willow Creek Association for churches that wanted to get those resources, and they began to share them and sort of build this organization of other churches that were all doing the seeker movement thing. They also started a global leadership summit initially, and it's out of the Willow Creek Association, and this was now it is in every continent, and it is a live simulcast leadership conference that is every August, the GLS. And then unfortunately, there was a large scandal that happened, and you can look this up, with Bill Hybels himself in 2018. And he has since left the church, and the church has really turned downward, and they are probably under half of what they were in attendance and across their churches, across their campuses. But the prayer is that they will continue to grow and be strong for Chicago, because God doesn't want his church to fail, and he won't let his church fail. And churches that have this big, a significant impact in one community and, in fact, in the world, the prayers that they will continue and refocus their efforts and repent from whatever failures and sins that they did commit as a church, as a leadership, whether it was trust issues or stewardship issues or whatnot, but that they would survive and grow. Now let's look at Saddleback Church in Orange County, California. Rick Warren was the one who founded this. And Rick Warren was a Southern Baptist pastor born in 1954. And he started Saddleback as a Bible study in January of 1980. Saddleback is an area of Orange County. So they just called it the Saddleback Church because of where they were. So in January 1980, they started a Bible study, and by Easter Sunday of 1980, they had 200 people in attendance. This church grew to 10,000 people before they built their first permanent worship facility in 1995. They went from a private home to schools, and then they started using these tents, which is quite amazing. In 1995, he also wrote The Purpose-Driven Church, which was the predecessor to The Purpose-Driven Life in 2002. And The Purpose-Driven Life became a worldwide bestseller, and it sort of brought Saddleback on the global map. Now they're currently 30,000 in attendance across 15 campuses in Southern California. Lake Forest campus is the main campus, and it seats 3,500 in their auditorium. They have 20,000 a weekend on that campus alone. And then there are 4 international campuses: Hong Kong, Berlin, Buenos Aires, and Santa Rosa. So this is a picture from the 90s, early 90s, of one of their tent meetings. This is the same building one side. Here's it looking the other way. And some of these tents are still on the campus, and they're used for other gatherings. Or one thing that Saddleback did, because it was Orange County, because they had so much room, they started to have worship services in different styles, different musical styles. They would have a contemporary style. They would have a traditional style. They would have a Hawaiian style, a Hispanic style, a country, an acoustic, and the music would all be done. So even on their own campus, they were actually doing multi-site, because then they would broadcast the message from the main auditorium into all these different places. And here is a Google Maps shot of their campus today. You can see as we sort of zoom in to the ministry offices building is larger than some churches, and they have all these parking lots. If you go and visit, they will have trams, and they will have golf carts that will help get you to the worship service, just like Disney, because they're right next door to Disneyland, and Southern California has to sort of compete with this whole concept of customer service and being very friendly and welcoming. And obviously that's what you want your church to be as well. But this is just such a large scale. You'll see the middle there, what says Saddleback Church, that is actually their junior high and high school ministry building, which was built in 2008, I believe. And that's actually bigger than their main auditorium. You'll see right in the middle there where it says underneath church and ministry, those are some of those tents that still exist. The college ministry is also in a tent building. And then you see there's another children's building that's just about as big as the middle school and high school building. And then where it says Saddleback Recovery Summit, that's just what Google put on it. But that is actually the auditorium right there. And then they have a music academy as well. So it is humongous. Hillsong Church. The only church that we'll talk about today that is not in the United States is actually in Sydney, Australia, as you might know. Founded by Brian Houston and his wife. And it was from the Australian Christian churches, or Assembly of God, in Australia. So while the American churches were Protestant, we had Reformed theology and Baptist theology backgrounds, this is the first that is a bit more Pentecostal. The Assembly of God is a Pentecostal movement. It was originally founded in 1983 as a Hills Christian Life Center, and it actually was renamed Hillsong Church in 1999 because of the success and recognition and basically we'd say now the branding of the Hillsong worship movement. Their worship recordings and television broadcast actually changed their identity as a church. Here's a fun picture from the 80s of the Houston family, and you notice the oldest boy is actually Joel Houston. Right here. And he's the one that founded Hillsong United. And then there's also Hillsong Worship, and we're quite familiar with their influence in the worship culture. Joel Houston is also one of the co-lead pastors of Hillsong New York. Now, different than Saddleback or other churches, Hillsong in Australia is planting churches. So Hillsong New York has its own pastor, teaching pastor. Hillsong LA, Hillsong London, Hillsong Hong Kong, they all have their own teaching pastors. But I believe they are all under the same eldership of Hillsong. We're still talking about the seeker movement. So if we remember all these other movements, they're still about drawing people in, giving people something that was different that they would want to come in and watch and see and be a part of. And North Point was the same way. Andy Stanley, born in 1958. He grew up as Southern Baptist. He's the son of a popular preacher and author, Charles Stanley. But North Point Community Church was decisively non-denominational. This is in Atlanta, Georgia, and they did not want to be seen as a church that was Southern Baptist or Methodist. They wanted to be a church for people who either didn't go to church anymore, who had given up on church, or wanted to try church again, but it wanted to be different. So we had the vision to launch in 1995. And when it launched, by 1998, it was the fastest growing church in America. It met in rented facilities for 3 years, and then it moved to its permanent building with an attendance of 2,000 people. And then by the time it got to 2002, it actually was using 2 different auditoriums in the same building, where he would be live on the West Auditorium and the East Auditorium. He would be on the screen, and they would move back and forth the regular attenders. So you actually had an assignment. Like if your last name was A through M, you would go to the East Auditorium, and N through Z, you'd go to the West Auditorium, and they would just keep switching back and forth. So people wouldn't always sit where Andy was preaching live. But if you were a guest or a visitor, you would always go to where he was preaching live. One thing they started that was huge was community groups. They didn't have Sunday school, and this was a big push against, not in opposition to, but just something different from the Southern Baptist churches. Instead of having Sunday school in their building, they wanted to have small groups, and so they were a champion of small groups early on. Today, there are 6 campuses with over 40,000 in attendance, including online presence, online campus itself. There's a big influence in the church world, in the evangelical world, because out of North Point, connected with North Point, are these conferences. The Passion Conference was started by Louis Giglio, who was a member of North Point Church for a long time. And the Passion Conference was a next generation youth college age conference about missions and worship. There's also the Catalyst Conference, which is started by Andy Stanley and Reggie Joyner. And this was a leadership conference to help train church leaders. And it was intentionally a leadership conference different from Willow Creek's Global Leadership Summit, which was about training leaders in leadership, whether they were Christian or not. And finally, I mentioned the Orange Conference. I read you join her when they started doing Children's Ministry Next Generation Ministry Conference, which has now become one of the prominent conferences in the whole country. As I mentioned, some of these churches have online campuses, and this is a new component, a new part of our life, a new part of reality for Christians. Growing out of maybe the seeker movement, we see, but we do see this opportunity to reach out to people, to be available to people in a way that is convenient to them, and in some ways, it's a way that's using the tools of technology to be in people's lives and connect people with Christ and connect people with each other. So these are the top 5 churches as of 2019. Life Church and Craig Rochelle is the obviously the premier church. They have 35 physical locations. Actually, I think they're up to 39 now. We just have one in Omaha as of 2 years old, and there's one in Colorado Springs, I think, launching next week or something like that. 70,000 members, including online attendance. So one thing that this list you need to understand is they have not just people watching a stream, but it's an online campus with a pastor dedicated to connecting with the people that are watching and interacting online. There's prayer requests, there's community groups, there's all of those things online, along with the physical campuses and locations. Church of the Highlands in Birmingham, Alabama, 15 locations and 40,000 members. North Point in Georgia, as we just said, only 6 locations, but still 40,000 members because of the online presence that they have. Saddleback Church has 19 locations and 30,000 members, including online. And I will note some of these churches that have, more than 6, 10 locations. Some of their locations are small. They're 300 to 500 to 1,000 people, but some are going to be 10 to 20,000. And then Elevation Church, the newest and fastest growing church right now in the country, has 21 physical locations and only 14 years old and has 27,000 members. So there are some major shifts going on as we now are in the 20th year of the 21st century. First of all, we see it's going from this mega church model to a multi-site church model. So instead of building an auditorium that seats thousands and you have 100-acre campus with parking lots and all sorts of things for people to do on campus, the shift has been to have multi-sites in neighborhoods and areas of your city or your community or even of your state or multiple states. But so you're building smaller communities, and there's different infrastructure advantages to that. There are challenges with that are different, but it allows the church to grow wider and not taller in size, so to speak. And I'm not sure if this will keep going. I sort of wonder if the multi-site church will eventually turn back into individual smaller churches where their own congregation has their own pastor instead of having the sermon coming in from somewhere else and being on screen. I'm wondering if they will just all eventually become their own communities again. The challenge with that is the amount of leadership and the amount of training for pastoral leadership is just going to be the challenge. The other thing that we see that happened in probably around 2005, 2010 was this final shift from seeker to missional model. The missional concept is more about go and be the church instead of come and see the church like the seeker model. And this happened actually because Willow Creek did a study and they saw all these people coming to church, but they weren't seeing spiritual growth. They weren't seeing people growing and being fully devoted followers of Christ. They weren't becoming mature Christians, and they wondered why. And they realized after a huge study that all their efforts to get people into church had actually backfired because they would not grow deep enough. And so they started to shift, and other churches as well started to shift away from the seeker model into just a straight worship model, an authentic, uh, community of believers model. So, and then the missional model along with that was being sent out and being the hands and feet and being more socially aware and serving their community. The question was asked by one church, if we disappeared as a church, would our city know? Is our city better because we are here? Not because our physical building is here, but because the people of our church are serving the city. And so that is a major change, this missional model of being the church, not just being a physical presence, but being the hands and feet of Christ. And again, as I said, the online streaming platforms and social media are changing how people are experiencing church. One last thing I'll say that maybe has shifted, and we'll talk more about this down the road, is with online streaming and social media and all of the opportunities to share things with on YouTube and Spotify and all these other streaming opportunities. Music now is being expressed and expanded and shared more than ever before. So there's a new sort of revival in the worship realm. And we'll talk about this later on in another lecture, but that has been a shift that we are starting to see here in the 21st century as well.